The first big challenge or topic I'd like to talk to you about is the topic of reachability. Now, every day in almost every area, industry, functional area, for almost every person in their job, it's a conflict between, on the one hand, being reachable, and on the other hand, not being reachable. The latter, not for the sake of not being reachable by itself, for itself, but rather in order to be able to concentrate on an important task and simply be productive at finishing, completing a certain task. What is the biggest advantage of being reachable? Well, I think it is that you're reachable. And what's the biggest benefit of not being reachable? Well, I think it's not being reachable. Just by putting it that way, I think it makes it very clear that it's a conflict. On the one hand, you want to be able to react quickly, you want to be informed, you want to help people, you want to give people a high level of service internally or externally. And on the other hand, you simply need time to complete certain things, to complete a particular task, ideally without being interrupted. Now, what can we do? There are numerous aspects that play a role when it comes to reachability. I'd like to start out by telling you a story that, first of all, I think is worth telling, and secondly, will most likely prompt yourself to ask yourself certain questions and to make certain decisions with respect to your reachability, your accessibility for other people. A few years ago, I went to a men's room. That's not the last time I went to a men's room. I can't put things that belong together so well. And I was standing at a urinal, and somebody else, another guy, was standing next to me, conducting a very similar activity. And up until then, nothing unusual. Then the other guy's cell phone rang, and to my surprise, he reaches to his pocket, pulls his cell phone out, and starts conducting this obviously business-related phone call. And he was still not quite finished with his other process, if you understand what I'm talking about. And he continued by pulling a sheet of paper out of the inside of his jacket, put it in between his elbow and the wall, pulled a pen out and started taking notes. He was sort of finished with the fluid part of his other process, if you understand what I'm talking about, but still not fully wrapped up again. I think you get the picture. Now, you might be chuckling, you might think this is an absurd situation. That's exactly what I thought too. And my next thought was, brilliant, now I have a new seminar and speech or event story I can tell people on the topic of reachability or accessibility. The question I asked myself a little bit later was, when do I want to be reachable? For whom do I want to be reachable? And through which channel or channels do I want to be reachable at a given time? And just as important are the questions, when do you not want to be reachable? When do you not want to be reachable for particular people or through particular channels like email or phone or personally? And those are exactly the questions I'd like to pass on to you and encourage you to make reasonable decisions. Of course, the answer to those questions and therefore your decisions depend on what you envision in terms of work-life balance, if we talk about reachability outside of regular work hours, however you might define those. That's one factor. Another factor is what role have you taken over? Of course, there will be different expectations towards the apprentice, let's say, of an organization or the CEO of an organization with respect to is the person reachable by cell phone, on their cell phone after 5 p.m. as an example. So it really depends on how you want to conduct your life and what kind of a role and therefore responsibilities did you take over. But I strongly, and that's my key point within this first subtopic, is that I strongly encourage to spend a few minutes thinking about what is the ideal form of limiting your access. How much do you want to be reachable? For whom do you want to be reachable? And through which channels does it make sense to be reachable in particular situations? And to make sure that whatever decision you make is the rule rather than the exception. Every rule can have some exceptions here or there, but it's very important to decide what is the exception and what is the rule. One of the easiest and most effective ways to increase your productivity is what I call HWMS. Now, you might be wondering, what does that stand for? It simply stands for hour with myself. What does that mean? What I mean by that is to simply block time, whether it's 20 minutes or it's 60 minutes or it's 3 hours, will obviously depend on your job, on your demands, and how well it is possible to block time. Now, that is a tip that you've probably heard, and there's a good chance that you've done that or at least attempted to block out time for particular very important tasks. However, when I ask participants at my live events how often they actually, when they plan to do something in particular, a particular task, let's say on Wednesday from 9 o'clock to 10 o'clock in the morning, how often or what their success rate is, how often do they actually do exactly what they planned to do when they blocked out the time. They might have even put it in their calendar so that they themselves and possibly other people can see that they're not available. When I ask people that question, what they usually tell me, and the answers they vary of course, but a lot of people tell me that only in about 20 or 30% of the situations where they intend to do something in particular at a particular time or within a particular hour, they actually do that. Very, very often something else happens and it's very easy to just move it, to push it off to a later point in time and let oneself be interrupted. So then the question is, how can we increase this success ratio of this percentage of 20-30% to twice or 3 times as much? And my recommendation on that topic is to treat the hour with yourself, mentally and practically, as if it was an appointment with one or numerous other people. Let's think about that. Let's say on Wednesday morning from 9 to 10, you had a client at your office, or you had somebody else, an executive or an employee within your team. If you're an executive yourself, in any case, somebody else is there, or you had a meeting with numerous other people. What would you do if somebody invited you to some other event or another meeting? You would say, well, thanks a lot, I'd like to come, but we have to find a different point in time. What would you do with your phone, or your phones possibly, your stationary phone and your cell phone? What would you do if you had a guest? You would probably turn them off or make sure in any case that you're not interrupted by the phone. What would you do with your emails if you had a client sitting next to you? Well, then in that time you wouldn't look at your emails most likely. And that's exactly why I recommend to treat the hour with yourself just like an appointment with another person. We tend to have more respect towards the task if that's how we view it. An important aspect with respect to the topic of reachability and accessibility is the question whether you have the door open or closed. Now, when I say open or closed door, I am referring to the door in a literal sense, but also in a figurative sense. Let's say there are 2 colleagues with whom you need to interact on a regular basis. And let's say they have 2 quite different approaches to having their door open or closed. Let's say person A is somebody, let's say on this end of the spectrum, person A is somebody who has the policy of the open door. The door is always open. So what are the results thereof? Well, if somebody needs something from this person A, there's no limit, there's no barrier. So whenever somebody needs something, or possibly somebody just walks by and thinks, oh, there's something I want to talk to that person about, that's an invitation to walk into the office. So there is no differentiation with respect to the topic that the person A is working on being something that is interruptible or ideally not so interruptible. Now, let's say there's another colleague of yours, let's say person B, and this person possibly attended a time management seminar and heard that you should keep your door closed as much as possible because you're more productive if you do that. Well, there's some truth to it, but what happens with person B when person B has the door closed all the time? Well, let's say you need to talk to the person and you see that the door is closed. Most likely, the first time you'll take it seriously. Possibly you'll take it seriously the second and third time, but at some point, sooner or later, you're going to go to yourself, well, this person's door is always closed. So at some point, you have to ignore it. So after a while, you're going to consistently ignore the fact that that door is closed. So you're going to behave as if the door was open all the time. So this person B initially blocked out some time, was probably more productive, but after a while, the effect decreased because people started ignoring the door. So person B, after a while, basically has the same situation that person A has, but this person B has lost the opportunity to use the door in an effective way as a signal that either one is interruptible or should only be interrupted if there's an emergency. So my suggestion is, both with respect to the door, literally speaking, but also with respect to being reachable through other channels, email, phone, etc., personally, etc., I strongly recommend to decide to be situation specific or task specific. That means that you consciously decide when you think that the advantages of being reachable overweigh, and when you think that the advantages of not being reachable overweigh, in other words, to consciously differentiate and consciously decide whether you're reachable or not. An important factor when it comes to deciding whether in a particular situation it makes sense to be reachable or not, in my opinion, is the question, is it more of a routine task or is it something that requires a high level of concentration? So let's say you have an Excel spreadsheet and there's 100 rows or 100 columns or lines or whatever, and you have to check, let's say, 100 different columns or lines and check whether yes or no, or check something fairly simple, and you need to go through it manually. Well, let's say you're at line number 30 and you get interrupted. Well, it's fairly easy to continue at line 31 then without losing too much time, without losing too much efficiency. If you're conducting a task like that is more routine, more of a routine task, then I think there are more advantages typically of being reachable, of being interruptible, compared to the advantages of not being interrupted. On the other hand, if you're trying to read a complex text or you're trying to plan something that is not so simple, you're trying to make an important decision, you have to get into a new topic, for instance, and if you're interrupted after 10 minutes, you basically have to start over again, then I would say that the advantages of not being reachable typically overweigh. So, in my opinion, a very important factor is the question, is it more of a routine task or is it something that requires a high level of concentration? And that is a factor that should go into the decision as to whether in a particular situation you are reachable, you are interruptible, or you are not, except for emergencies. That means real emergencies. Have you ever experienced the following situation? You meet with a colleague and you're fully engaged in the conversation. You're fully concentrating on the subject matter at hand. And then somebody comes by and asks one of the two of you a question related to a totally different topic. After that interruption, no matter whether the interruption took 20 seconds or 20 minutes, often it's very difficult to remember where you were. Sometimes it's so extreme that it's difficult to even remember the topic you were talking about. I'm sure you've encountered situations very similar, very parallel to what I just described in business and in your personal life, most likely as well. Now, what can we do to deal with that situation? There's a very simple suggestion, and that is when you get interrupted, and that happens a lot of times every day typically, to jot down where you were. That could be very simple. In an Excel spreadsheet, it might be putting a certain color or font or changing the particular cell that you were at. It could mean that if you're reading a text, you just simply write a word or just put a line where you ended up when you got interrupted. Or it could mean in a conversation, to get back to that example, is you just write down a certain keyword, and that makes it much, much easier to, when the interruption is over, as I said, no matter whether it's 20 seconds or 20 minutes or any other period of time, to then go back to the actual subject matter, the actual task, without having lost any more time than the time that the interruption actually took. So jot down, make some sort of a note on whether it's a line, whether it's a particular word, that'll make it much, much easier for you to return to the actual task without losing more time than necessary.